Welcome, everyone. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On YouTube, you can subscribe to @grade level reading. On Facebook and Instagram, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow us @reading by third. And on LinkedIn, you can follow us also at Campaign for GLR. Once again, welcome everyone to our 6th session of our GLR Week 2025. My name is Leah Cruz, and I will be behind the scenes helping produce the conversation today. Then before we get started, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge our enterprise and program funders, as well as our individual donors. And a special thank you to our growing circle of sustaining LEO sponsors. LEO is our learning and engagement opportunities, and that is what we are engaging in right now with you all. Your support not only allows us to hold these vital conversations, but it also helps us create meaningful opportunities for experts and educators to share insights, foster connections, and build the CGLR community. So thank you. And we do have a few housekeeping tips to go over before we get started. We would love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. And I see it's already busy going. I see people already introducing themselves, letting us know where you're tuning in from. So you may use that chat box at the bottom of your screen to share your name, city, state, organization, whatever you'd like to share with us, and also ongoing thoughts throughout the conversation. You are in listen-only mode, but you do have that chat box as well as the Q&A box. We will dedicate a portion of the webinar to respond to those questions live, and we'll also have our panelists will be answering those throughout the webinar. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed. We will share the recording and any resources that come up during the webinar or have been provided to us by the panelists when we send a follow-up email to all registrants. And we will also be sharing a link to the slides and the bios for today's panelists in the chat, so you can follow along in real time if you'd like. And then lastly, we'll have a brief on-screen evaluation during the Q&A, and we highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement and making sure we're bringing you quality webinars that are helping you in your work. We do have a couple more sessions for GLR Week 2025 tomorrow. So join us tomorrow and for 2 sessions. One is featuring United Ways and their work around Alice families. And then we also have our afternoon session is kicking off a new series on parents as curators of their children's education. So that one is balancing choice, equity, and accountability, and it's at 3 p.m. tomorrow. We are rebroadcasting sessions that actually are very much tied to this session today for our August rebroadcast series. So we'll be doing our rebroadcast of our More Hopeful Futures or Children as Collateral Damage, examining accelerated deportation, Medicaid, SNAP, and then actually a rebroadcast of this session today. They will include some new commentary and new context since they originally aired. And then we also have some new live sessions coming in September where we will continue to highlight big bet interventions and approaches that are advancing early school success for children in economically disadvantaged families. Now, I am happy to turn it over to Sierra Sanchez. She's a program associate with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and she will take from here. Enjoy the webinar.
Sounds good. Thank you, Leah. Sorry, I was sending so many great links in the chat for folks to register to join us for upcoming sessions. As Leah said, hopefully you can join us for tomorrow, continuing with GLR Week 2025. In the meantime, though, I wanted to sincerely thank you for joining us for today's 6th GLR Week 2025 plenary session, titled Disproportionate Impact Magnified, Rural America's Children as Collateral Damage. At CGLR, we are very aware that the majority of the 350 stakeholder coalitions in our network who are participating in the collective impact work to address issues impeding early literacy development and early school success are serving children and families in rural communities where resources have always been few and far between. As such, CGLR has consistently focused on their unique needs and assets and addressed these issues and advancements in our GLR Learning Tuesdays learning and engagement opportunities. The recent passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, coupled with the other proposed federal spending cuts, threatens programs like Medicaid, SNAP, Head Start, and the Digital Equity Act, exacerbating long-standing challenges faced by children and families living in rural communities, where resources are already limited and funding in support of learning and development has to be stretched much further than in most metro communities. These policy shifts could prove catastrophic for the many children living in rural areas who, data shows, rely more heavily on the resources made available through these federal programs. Building on our recent series of sessions that have focused on whether and how the current federal policy shifts will help all American children thrive or render them collateral damage amidst the massive efforts to cut government spending, today we will zero in on the outsized impacts these cuts have on children living in rural communities. Rural communities, often left out of national policy conversations, stand to be disproportionately affected by these policies. Census data shows rural children rely more heavily on Medicaid, 47 to 38%, and SNAP, 14 to 12%, than their urban peers. In addition, nearly half of all rural students are eligible for free and reduced price meals, and close to one-third are students of color, while the population of English learners in rural schools has grown in recent years to more than 3%, demonstrating how these significant cuts to the U.S. Department of Education will have even greater impacts in these communities. Thankfully, advocates and local leaders have been working to find ways to ensure that children in rural communities can continue to receive the services they need today. And today we have the chance to engage with these leaders and advocates to learn more about both the urgent challenges and the potential solutions in these non-metro regions. We will have the opportunity to hear from those with expertise and experience serving these remote communities with large populations of native and migrant farming families, and leaders who are identifying creative ways to blend and braid available funds when faced with drastic cuts. We are excited to learn from our panel and hope we will also have a chance to hear from all of you who are here joining us, who can share some of your experiences as well. And today, we are extremely lucky to have a leading voice in advocacy and programming for rural children leading and moderating our conversation. Julia Cunningham was the Director of Rural Engagement at the United States Department of Education, where she led rural engagement and strategy to support departmental priorities, advise senior leadership regarding rural policy and messaging, and regularly communicated with rural stakeholders, educators, learners, and leaders nationwide. Now, I'm also introduced to welcome and briefly introduce our esteemed panelists with us today in alphabetical order. Please note that their full bios are linked in the chat, so I'm just giving a short preview of who we have with us today. Benga Ajilore, PhD, is the Chief Economist at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He most recently served as a senior advisor in the Office of the Undersecretary for Rural Development at the United States Department of Agriculture. Myra Alvarez, MHA, is president of the Children's Partnership, a California-based nonprofit advocacy organization working to advance child health equity by ensuring all children have the resources and opportunities they need to grow up healthy and lead productive lives. Josie Green Oglala Lakota is the executive director of Teach for America South Dakota. As Wa Wulanglake, she's charged with ensuring the work of the local team is done consciously and carefully in alignment with local aspirations and partners. Emily Moore is the Senior Policy Analyst at Voices for Virginia's Children, where she leads policy and advocacy work in health equity and family economic security. She currently serves as Vice Chair of the Children's Health Insurance Program Advisory Committee of Virginia. Kayla Patrick is Senior Fellow at the Century Foundation, most recently having served as a Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education, where she was the primary policy and political lead for all K-12 grant programs. And lastly, Melissa Sadorf, EDD, serves as the Executive Director of the National Rural Education Association, bringing over 30 years of experience in rural education as teacher, principal, and superintendent in Arizona. With that, I wanted to welcome all of you. We look forward to learning and engaging with you. And now I'm excited to turn it over to our great moderator, Julia Cunningham, to get our conversation going. Julia?
Yes, thank you so much, Sierra. And thank you to our panelists for taking the time to be here today. It's really great to see such a large turnout for a conversation on rural education. This is a topic that impacts every single one of us, whether we're cognizant of it or not. So I'm going to make sure that we have as much time as possible for our panelists to contribute, but I'm just going to take a minute or two first to set a bit of context for our conversation. I'm sure this will be really familiar framing for those of you who live and work in rural communities, but hopefully it will allow us all to kind of start this conversation from a similar mindset. Often when we talk about rural in our country, many of us picture like a farmhouse or a silo or a specific type of person or a place or a mountain range. We've all been guilty of it, myself included. We all have these kind of preconceived notions of what rural looks like. But the reality is, and our panelists will dive into this more, rural America is wildly diverse, whether that be landscapes, culture, race, income level, political affiliation, workforce needs, immigration status. I could go on and list a million other characteristics that vary across rural communities across the country. And rural public schools educate an incredible amount of learners. Around 1 in 5 public school students is a rural student, and each of them really represents this great diversity that embodies these rural communities. So when we in the larger education community, in the larger education conversation, don't talk about the rural needs or don't consider the rural context in our decision making, we're neglecting the needs of millions of students who trust us to build a better future for them. So thank you to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for recognizing this critical conversation, because it's one that we really should be having constantly. And also with that in mind, I also want to stress how incredibly interconnected many of our rural communities are and how critical that is to consider when thinking about the impacts of policy in rural America. This is a huge asset for our rural communities. Services can be provided more efficiently. Students often receive more personalized attention, but it can also be a challenge at times. That's because when one sector is impacted, those ripple effects are felt throughout the entire community. So when a hospital is closed, not only are there fewer services, but unemployment, it becomes a huge issue. Schools lose access to many critical services that they relied on for the hospital to provide, and so on and so forth. And often on that note, the school is the hub of the community. They host community events, they provide wraparound services, they support continued learning for adults. And so when the livelihood of a rural school is at risk, so is the livelihood of the full community. And then I'll just end with, before we get started with questions for our panelists, for those of you who maybe are newer to working in the rural space or who would like to learn more about it, I just ask you to keep remember 2 things while we go through this conversation and as you learn more about rural America. One, rural doesn't just mean not urban. Students in rural areas, just like their peers in urban and suburban communities, have unique needs and deserve to be thought of in their full context. And 2, rural communities are diverse, vibrant, interconnected, innovative, and every single one of them has something to teach us. So we try really hard not to think of what they lack, but what they bring to the table. So with that, hopefully sets up our conversation a little bit. I would like to get started and introduce our first panelist. I'm going to ask each of our panelists a question before we dive into kind of a full panel discussion. So I'm going to start with Benga. And Benga, you recently published an article discussing impacts on rural households of policy decisions that are being made at the federal level. Can you ground us in an understanding of what we're talking about when we say rural community? What's the profile of a rural community, and why are programs like Medicaid and SNAP so critical for these communities?
Thank you, Julia. I want to thank, we can go back to the previous slide. Sorry. I'd like to thank CGLR for inviting me to speak about this and to talk about rural issues. And so to answer your important question, I kind of want to pick up where you left off, talking about rural communities and kind of ground the audience in terms of how we think about rural areas. And so the first question you asked is, what is a profile of a rural community? If you could jump to the next slide. And the way I like to answer that is there is no one profile of a rural community. I remember I was at this seminar and this person said, if you've been to one rural town, you've been to one rural town. And so in this map here, what we have is places designated as rural by county, and you can see it covers all the country. You know, one thing that people don't realize is that every state has rural areas, you know, from Alaska all the way down to Rhode Island. And so in all these places, some are close to metro areas, some are further away, but everywhere there's rural places. The other thing about the realities of rural places is that they're racially diverse, industrial diverse, and they have high potential. So in this slide here, basically what it shows is that while you look at the percentage of people of color in rural areas, if you look at it nationally, it's less in rural areas than in non-rural areas. But if you look by region, so for example, in the South, Black people are a huge percentage of rural areas. You look at the Plains area, tribal communities play a huge role. You look at the Southwest and the Southeast, Latino people are a huge part. So it's very racially diverse. We can go to the next slide. People think about rural as agriculture and try to equate them, but it's not the same. What this chart shows is what rural areas, what they're dependent in terms of industrial sector. And so you have farming is, right there in that central area. Manufacturing is the one in purple, so you see more towards kind of like the industrial Midwest. We have recreational areas. But one thing to note is that the majority of rural communities there is no dependency in terms of industry. There's a mix of agriculture, manufacturing, mining, services, even the federal sector plays a huge role in rural communities. If we go to the next slide. And so one of the things to think about is that a lot of times when we talk about rural communities, we always talk about it within a deficit frame in terms of what they lack. But here, and comes from the Urban Institute, where they created taxonomy of assets in rural areas and looking at, using what we call the community capitalist framework, where what is it that a community already has? And so there's all these different types of assets, where there's natural resources, where there's certain kinds of institutions, where there's civic engagement. But basically, to think about assets, people are assets. And in any community where there are people, there are assets that are worthy of investment and that have value. So next slide. That said, one of the things that we have to think about in terms of the reality of rural places is that you're looking at persistent poverty counties, which is defined as having a poverty rate of above 20% over the last 30 years. 85% of persistent poverty counties have entirely rural populations. This slide here has another measure called Distressed Communities Index, where they take, it's an index of well-being over a number of different measures, and they put it into different quintile. But basically, they kind of categorize communities basically from prosperous all the way down to distressed. And what you see is that, a quarter of rural communities are considered distressed, and then even 23% are at risk. On the flip side, 50% are doing pretty well from mid-tier up to prosperous, but it's still important to understand the reality. And the next slide. So to think about this in terms of now that we see that rural communities are very diverse, some doing well, some doing poorly, one of the things to think about is that when we talk about federal funding and why federal funding is needed in rural America, particularly for children, no matter whether you live in a city of 2 million or a town of 2,000, we want to have healthy and thriving communities where our kids and our neighbors' kids have abundant opportunity. As was mentioned at the top, because of persistent poverty, a lot of people in rural areas use Medicaid. Medicaid's been vital, crucial for rural hospitals and viability. SNAP has been very important, not just for rural families and households, but for grocers in these rural communities. And healthcare is going to be also important. I'm going to hear more about that, but just wanted to kind of give this broad overview of how we need to think about rural communities and what we can do for rural communities.
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan. I think that does a great job of getting us started and thinking about these common definitions and these common contexts. So I'm going to go now to Emily. Emily, I know this is also a topic that you have been thinking about recently, particularly from the Virginia lens. So can you tell us a bit about what you've seen in Virginia and elsewhere, particularly around healthcare access challenges in rural communities, and how are these challenges felt in early elementary school classrooms? And can you help us understand kind of your advocacy strategy to ensure the communities get the services they need?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Julia and everybody. So glad to be here with you today and grateful that we are taking time with this conversation to dive deeper into just one program or one cut, because it really is how all of this adds up. Young people and their families don't live single issue lives. They don't exist in silos, And our advocacy work should not be siloed or be single issue either. So at Voices, we really look at this from a holistic perspective. When policymakers chip away at one support system, those ripples are felt across every aspect of a child's life, from their doctor's office to their dinner plate, and eventually at their desk at school. Right now, as a result of HR 1, we are really staring down a set of policy decisions made by Congress and have been signed into law now by the president that are going to gut critical programs for all of our kids, but especially those living in rural communities. It really is a double whammy, triple whammy, a quadruple whammy in some instances for families to cut Medicaid and healthcare and SNAP at the same time, taking away critical food, critical healthcare from families who already have difficulties accessing those resources in some of their communities. In order to realize this $990 billion in Medicaid cuts and $187 billion in SNAP cuts over the next 10 years, Congress has really made some budgetary decisions that are framed as addressing waste, fraud, and abuse. But the reality is that those provisions are creating more red tape and bureaucracy that are going to make it even more difficult for families to navigate applying for and maintaining these benefits, which we know in Virginia, we already have a difficult time with our under-resourced and understaffed agencies, especially in our rural communities. And we know that losing these benefits is going to be devastating for any family, right? But for children, especially those in early childhood and in adolescence, the impact on their healthy development is going to be both immediate and long-term. And so in Virginia, we are deeply concerned about these impacts. We've been compiling a bunch of different pieces of research and doing our own analysis to let our lawmakers know really what we can expect. And while most folks, when they think about Virginia, think about our bustling Northern Virginia suburbs and the military and tourism of Hampton Roads, the reality is that about 40% of Virginia's localities are considered rural or non-metro. And in these communities, the stakes are going to be even higher as a result of losing these critical services. As you heard from Benga and from Sierra, it holds true in Virginia. 38% of children in Virginia's rural areas rely on Medicaid and CHIP. And these are real children, real families who could be left with no coverage at all as a result of this bill. And for those that retain their coverage, they are going to be faced with limited, or in some cases, no access to providers nearby in their community. We already hear from folks that are driving 30 minutes to an hour to get to specialist appointments, even rural communities that are saying that they don't even have providers that can provide mental health services in their communities. So we're talking about more folks that are going to miss out on their basic care, their immunizations, their dental visits, their glasses so they can read their schoolwork. And then, of course, there's SNAP on top of those cuts. And in Virginia's rural localities, food insecurity runs really deep, with 68% of rural counties experiencing high childhood food insecurity. And we are really concerned specifically that Virginia will be faced with rolling back some of the flexible state options that we have that has made SNAP more accessible to families that need it, like broad-based categorical eligibility, which expanded SNAP to nearly 25,000 additional families in Virginia. So what does all this have to do with education? You might be wondering. I hope we all know, but I think it's pretty simple, is that these cuts are going to culminate in the classroom. When a child loses Medicaid, they are more likely to miss their regular checkups, their vision screenings, those early interventions that catch learning loss or learning delays and developmental concerns. And when they lose SNAP, their diet suffers, their health suffers as a result. We know that hunger doesn't just mean a growling belly. It means difficulty concentrating. It means lower test scores and chronic absenteeism and increased behavioral challenges. And then when their families are faced with losing both of those, that stress at home is going to skyrocket. And that often increases the reports of child abuse and neglect and initiates child welfare involvement, further straining our families. And who's going to see these consequences first? Our teachers, our cafeteria staff, our school counselors, our nurses, the folks in our school systems that are some of the first to notice when a child's behavior changes, or when they start showing up late to school, when they don't show up at all to school. And our teachers are often left trying to fill in these gaps. They're bringing in their own snacks to feed kids. They're showing up with an extra layer of patience because it is difficult work, always, but especially these days. And then they're also trying to make referrals to systems that are already stretched too thin. And then there's the economic toll in Virginia, which is we're facing some realities of the way in which we want to address this is going to maybe be a little more difficult than kind of how we would dream about it. Virginia has to balance its budget like many other states. And for SNAP alone, Virginia is facing almost $315 million per year in cost shifts, just based on the analysis that we're able to do with the numbers we have right now. It's over 700 million when budgeting on a biennial basis. It's more than the biennial budget of our entire Office of Veterans and Defense Affairs in Virginia. And when it comes to Medicaid and the reduction in payments through provider taxes, which we use to help fund our Medicaid expansion in Virginia, we're looking at a reduction of billions of dollars a year to our state hospitals. So these impacts are going to be felt really hard in rural communities. Virginia already has maternity care deserts in 31% of its counties, and all of those are rural localities. And we have 6 rural hospitals that are at serious risk of closing or scaling back these services. So the safety net's not just going to be stretched thin, it's going to be frayed, and folks are going to be having to go elsewhere to seek that care. SNAP cuts are also going to ripple through our rural economies. Families are going to buy less healthy food, especially local produce and fruit. Our local markets will suffer. Farmers will lose steady income. In Virginia, it's estimated that about 400 retailers are at high risk due to SNAP cuts, and almost all of them are in rural areas or areas that are already experiencing food insecurity and have food deserts. So it's a real full circle impact that we're looking at here. And some will say that these cuts don't directly affect children, but we know better because we know there's a ripple effect. When children lose Medicaid and SNAP, they lose access to programs like free and reduced price school meals, WIC, summer EBT, rural non-congregate summer meals, Head Start eligibility, services that come to rural communities to help lift them up. And let's be real, these impacts are not going to be felt evenly. 59% of Black children in Virginia and 43% of Latino children in Virginia benefit from either Medicaid or SNAP or both. So these cuts really will just deepen racial and geographic disparities that already exist. But I don't want to end on despair because I know that our educators and our advocates are some of the fiercest fighters, and we have been fighting and we will continue fighting. So it's especially important to note that this webinar falls on the 60th anniversary of Medicaid. It's a powerful reminder of the promise that we've made our nation, that we can ensure that families and children access affordable healthcare. And we are just a month behind. 79 years ago, President Harry Truman signed the National School Lunch Act into law. And he noted that it was a matter of national security. So in Virginia, what we are doing is reminding our state lawmakers that the well-being of our children is still a matter of national security. And we're bringing our advocates and our parents and our educators to our state legislator to make those connections clear, that we're not just defending programs, we are really defending the full experience of childhood. And we are defending their well-being and defending their ability to come together as a community and be supported. So Virginia is working towards trying to not force that either or narrative. We don't want to fight for the same pieces of the funding pie that we've always been fighting for. We're encouraging our lawmakers to look at ways to raise revenue. For example, a fair share tax that would raise over $1 billion in revenue for critical programs in Virginia, paired with a state level child tax credit targeted to low and moderate income families. So our promise to our children and our families here in Virginia is that we're not going to give up the fight. It has turned to a state level fight, and we are really ready to keep on marching. This promise of Medicaid and SNAP was never meant to be temporary or conditional, and we owe it to them to maintain that promise.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in Virginia. I think this is a perfect transition into our next guest. I actually taught middle school for 4 years in rural South Dakota, and those wraparound services, those whole child needs were so critically important and are still so critically important. And so I'm so glad that Josie Green is here today. So Josie, can you talk a bit about the context in South Dakota, where there are several sovereign Native nations and a significant number of Native students enrolled in public schools throughout the state? How are you seeing federal decisions, particularly in education and health, really uniquely impact Indigenous children? And what have you seen at the state level so far as a response to some of these recent decisions?
Thank you, Julia. And hi, it's so good to see you. I'm just down the road from where you used to teach. And so it feels very good to be in this conversation together. And so thanks for the invitation and thanks for the question too. And I'll do my best to answer pieces of that. but did want to lead with like just remembering for all of us that there are over 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States, each with their own unique communities and cultures. And South Dakota has 9, like you named, and as one Lakota person from the Oglala Sioux tribe. Can't speak for all of the nations, even in South Dakota, but I can say and do want to make clear too for everyone because it's constantly a reminder for me to remember that to be a sovereign nation means that all nations hold a unique relationship with the US government as a sovereign nation, given treaty obligations that establish this nation to nation relationship. And so, in effect, everything that's already been named here by panelists will affect and land in our communities as well. But how they do is potentially complex given this legal relationship. And I'm particularly in admiration and in deep trust of our tribal education leaders who are holding that complex reality, constantly working through layers to identify what will be in effect, what is happening today, what is going to happen in 2 years, and does this apply to us, and in what way will it apply? But the way that they're doing so is, I think, something that we can all learn from, is just continuing to always put the well-being of, for us, Lakota Wakaija at the forefront of any decision. I heard the word earlier today, relentlessly, just relentlessly caring for Lakota children now as they're presently in existence in their vital humanity, but also in their futures, ensuring that they can have a future. And so I'm thinking a lot about the complex navigation that's required to do that and ensuring that as somebody who leads an organization, that must take their lead given the unique relationship with the federal government, with the US government, and ensuring that who we're working for is Native students in their own communities as their own nations, and needing to understand what the federal decisions are, but having to work through, again, those layers. And so, one decision that's been really close to my heart, close to our organization and community, and has had a ripple effect in our community already, has been some of the cuts to just AmeriCorps. And AmeriCorps in our community has supported and developed local talent, locally, locally grown talent, as well as talent from outside communities to come to our rural community and bring the resources that they have. AmeriCorps has like helped enable that to be a reality for education in general, as well as educators specifically. And so that's both for our organization, but also a number of organizations here in South Dakota on Pine Ridge and Rosebud. And those cuts have made immediate um, impacts where teachers are no longer in classrooms, where community members are no longer supporting Lakota language, something that's been a vital necessity and has been named over and over as a need in our communities. And for Teach for America, we've been able to hold this for the time being, but it has been really important for us to be able to support educators to join the teaching profession, because what has been named is that this teaching profession has become something very different than what it has been over the last even 10 years, even the last 5 years, knowing that all of the wellness and requirements for a student to be a whole person, to be healthy, often results in or often lands in a school system, in a classroom system. And so the teachers, I think, are really tired, and they have been really tired. And so a number of ways that these decisions land, as has been named, falls into the classroom. And for us, AmeriCorps specifically has just been something that can incentivize more people to join what is a profession of creativity, of brilliance, of innovation. And so needing more of those types of innovations and incentives has been really important for us. And so the other thing that I did want to just name is that for us at Teach for America South Dakota, we've worked with sovereign nations for about 20 years now and have learned to follow the lead, and fit in where we can truly provide resources and lift, knowing that classrooms, again, have the opportunity to provide wellness. And so something we're doing right now, in addition to our teacher support, is providing like a high school course dedicated to something that young people and community have always named as needs, which is Lakota language, Lakota culture, and college access. So this last year we taught a college or a Lakota language course along with one of our teachers at a public high school on the Rosebud Reservation. And this year it will also include college access support. And I name it as an innovation because it's something that's just been needed and is always at jeopardy because it really relies on the people who were named as assets, and who need that sustainability. But all of these decisions will always impact not only the students, but the people who are working in classrooms who also need their own endurance, their own sustainability and maintenance and vitality. So that's what I'll share for now. And I'll pass it back to you, Julia.
Thank you. Sorry, my screen froze for a second. But yes, thank you so much, Josie. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. For those of you, for all of you to know the work that Josie does in South Dakota is a really great example of kind of community-led engagement. So encourage you to learn from them. Now we're going to turn to Myra. So Myra is joining us from the Children's Partnership. And Myra, in California, you're working with an often overlooked but really critical and growing rural community, or rural population, migrant farming communities. And how are the policies that we've discussed so far and the changes that we've discussed so far, as well as the increased attention nationally on migrant families and the fear that they face around deportation, impacting children and families? What have you seen? And can you also share how both state and local community leaders are working to support these vulnerable families and the assets that they bring to the region?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Julia. And thank you to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for the opportunity to join you all and be part of this distinguished panel. I bet many of you are wondering why someone from California is on this panel on rural communities. I think the other states are more associated with rural communities, but I'm proud to be part of this conversation and really want to highlight what many of our presenters have already said. What Julia opened with, what Benga really highlighted is the diversity of rural communities. And how diverse those communities are in states like California that everyone thinks is only urban and only big city. Every county, we have 58 counties in California, and every county in California except San Francisco has rural populations within our counties. 6 of our counties are entirely rural. And again, many of our rural areas are vast and have these important cities that frankly make our state and our country run. And I'll talk about that. But it really highlights the diversity of what rural communities are, what they look like, and who they encompass. And I also want to highlight that as our urban areas, as our central located big cities become more and more expensive, we are seeing more and more of our communities, our diverse communities, move into our rural areas. And frankly, over the course of years, change those areas and bring different perspectives and cultures to these communities that really just expands who our communities are. And again, that definition of what rural communities are in California and across the country. But to Julia's conversation, I want to speak specifically about an incredibly important aspect of our rural communities, and that's our farm worker communities in California. These are hardworking individuals that frankly form the backbone of our agricultural industry and always have faced numerous challenges, but frankly, right now in this environment, are facing notably exacerbated challenges as a result of policy changes, as a result of political rhetoric, and as a result of many of the decisions of our elected officials. So let me just break it down a few of the numbers so you can think of the population of who California's farm workers are. Roughly between 1/3 and half of all farm workers in our country reside in the state of California. That's about 500 to 800,000 farm workers. Many folks point to California as the United States salad bowl, right? We produce 1/3 of our nation's vegetables, nearly 2/3 of our nation's fruits and nuts. 90% of the strawberries that are grown in this country are grown in the state of California. And while nationally, more than 40% of farm workers are undocumented immigrants, in California, approximately 75% of farm workers are undocumented. So again, in thinking about the industry and what makes the food, the fruits and vegetables on our table possible, it is our undocumented populations. So before I speak specifically to that, I do just want to build on a few of the comments that people have said and that have highlighted just the really devastating impacts of HR1 and that diverse array of impacts. In thinking about Medicaid in California, 1 out of 3 Californians rely on the Medicaid program. It's about 15 million Californians. So obviously, this is disproportionately impacting families in rural communities and also children. Over 5 million children in California rely on Medicaid. That's almost over 60% of our kids. And while, yes, they are disproportionately children of color, they are actually some counties in our rural areas where 90% of the children rely on Medi-Cal, which is Medicaid in California. Because of HR1, we expect up to 3.5 million people in California that rely on Medi-Cal will lose that coverage, including over 150,000 children. But it goes beyond Medicaid and also into our health insurance marketplace that was made possible by the Affordable Care Act, where close to 660,000 people are projected to lose coverage. And beyond coverage, it's also about the infrastructure of our healthcare system. So I really want to think about rural hospitals that, again, have had tremendous difficulty in keeping their doors open before HR1 are now going to be devastated even more by the cuts to Medicaid. And that's access to healthcare services, particularly for birthing people. Maternal care deserts are seriously impacting our birth crisis in California and across this country. And that's something that we want to consider. And then, of course, there's also the SNAP cuts where we project up to 395,000 people will lose benefits. But for all of these are disproportionately going to impact our immigrant families and, again, disproportionately impact our farm worker communities. One thing we haven't talked about in HR1 is that HR1 represents the largest single investment in interior immigration enforcement since the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Roughly $170 billion will go towards immigration enforcement, including billions for enforcement and deportation, for detention capacity, and for activities that, frankly, we have not seen since some of the darkest times in our country's history. And I'm sure we've seen, news reports. I'm sure people have heard stories and anecdotes, but I want to emphasize that what we've witnessed under this administration is really unprecedented, that the violent attacks on immigrant communities is impacting absolutely directly those that are detained and deported, but also those that are watching, including many of our children. Half of California's 9 million children have at least one immigrant parent. So the question around immigration status, and how it impacts their well-being is going to impact millions more than those intended, so to speak. And again, not only with the separation and the fear of separation and the mental health impacts, but also the economic fallout as a result of not having the security of a two-parent household or of the working parent, the fear, the instability within immigrant communities and within the farm worker community. And we are hearing that already. We are hearing that from schools reporting rates of absenteeism as a result of these activities. We are hearing from providers that families aren't showing up to visits, that aren't doing their regular everyday activities as a result of these fears. And these are going to be long-standing implications on the well-being of children. The cumulative impact of these policies on children is far-reaching. Again, beyond physical health, it's the stress, the uncertainty that will spill over into education, thinking about how anxiety affects concentration, attendance, and performance overall. So we'll talk a little bit more about the opportunities to support communities, but really want to emphasize what others have said about the intersectional nature of this bill, of this new law and the cuts, and the opportunity to support our farm worker communities and rural communities, and by doing so, support all of our communities as a whole.
Yes, thank you so much, Myra, and thank you for your advocacy in this really, really critical time. Kayla, I am going to turn to you next. You recently wrote about the abandoning of students in rural communities, and so was hoping that you could build a bit on what we've learned from our speakers so far and help us understand why Department of Ed funding is so critical to rural children, as well as how Medicaid is critical for important services such as school-based mental health.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to join this conversation, and a special thank you to you, Julia, for your service. I just want to talk about the passage of HR 1 and the ongoing efforts to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education, and just highlight that these aren't just administrative actions or savings. These cuts are deeply personal for families around the country who depend on federal dollars, whether they know it or not. And this is especially true in rural areas. These cuts jeopardize not just opportunity, but the very infrastructure that keeps children safe, healthy, and ready to learn. So let's just take a step back and think about why these programs even exist. In the 60s, President Johnson signed a series of anti-poverty laws and civil rights laws, including the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, known as ESEA, and the Social Security amendments that established Medicaid. This is the first time the federal government said plainly, poverty shouldn't determine a child's future. I think those are values that we should all agree on. It was part of this war on poverty strategy that was meant to provide opportunity and civil rights protections to students who have been overlooked for far too long, and especially students in rural and low-income communities. So at the time, ESEA largely focused on Title I funding, but over the next several decades, that bill has been tweaked. In 2001, there was targeted funding put in that bill for rural students, and now that vision is being dismantled. So why does this matter? As Julia mentioned, nearly 1 in 5 American children attend rural or schools in rural areas. Rural schools serve a higher share of low-income students than urban districts. They are underfunded, period. But in many places, local property taxes just can't generate enough revenue, and states are inconsistent in filling that gap for rural schools. So this has a potential to make education even more uneven in this country. And we know that education is not even across this country. So rural schools often lack full-time counselors, as my fellow panelists have said, nurses. They don't have the same AP courses. They don't have the same access to advanced or regular STEM opportunities. And it's sometimes difficult to recruit and retain high-quality educators, which we know make all the difference in schools. So for many children, the school building is the only place that they can experience a caring adult, or talk to a therapist, or get a hot meal, or access the internet. And we know that supports through ESEA and Medicaid really help to provide those things. So in rural areas, 1 in 3 children rely on Medicaid, and this is kind of a hidden part of the education system. I think folks really don't know that schools can bill Medicaid for services, whether that be school nurses, counselors, or occupational therapists, and many of them do. So cuts to Medicaid mean thousands of students in rural areas just lose access to healthcare. And then when that federal support is removed, rural districts don't have private foundations or big city philanthropists to fall back on. They just go without. And so some rural schools don't even really qualify for Title I because how poverty is distributed across the country. So sometimes they're too small, and poverty is widespread but not concentrated in one school building. And so Congress created the federal rural education programs to really target places like that, to hire educators, invest in teacher training, to reduce class sizes, to access broadband or tech tools or curriculum, to expand after-school programs or provide summer learning opportunities, or to launch career-focused programs that we know are important at this time. So while these are maybe considered modest funds that the federal Department of Education provides to states, they have outsized impact, especially for rural communities. And this administration, unfortunately, is proposing in their FY26 budget to roll back a lot of these funds. One of the things they're proposing to do is to consolidate 18 K-12 programs, including the rural education program, into one block grant. This block grant would eliminate the targeted purpose, guardrails, and accountability for each of those individual programs, which will particularly affect small and high-need districts. Block grants strip federal funding of its purpose, so those funds will no longer be required to be invested in rural areas. That means rural students can be easily overlooked, especially in states where education funding has been put on the back burner. And states will have to weigh competing needs. And let's face it, no state is perfect. And no state is fully funding public schools. So while states already have a lot of flexibility within programs, they will have even more flexibility and have to make difficult decisions like hiring teachers in an urban district or hiring teachers in a rural area. So those are like some of the big federal programs that we talk a lot about in terms of when we're talking about rural education, but there are also smaller, lesser known programs like the Full Service Community School Program, which brings together schools and community partners to offer healthcare, mental health services, after school and family engagement. This is essential when the nearest clinic might be 30 miles away in a rural area. And so one of the things that the Biden administration did was increase the funding for full service community schools fivefold. And the law requires that they set aside 15% of that funding for rural areas. During the course of the administration, they actually invested 20% of that funding in rural areas, and those communities really rely on programs like the full service community schools. In addition, the discretionary grant programs for mental health have been cut. This Department of Education cut 264 grants across the country that were expected to add an additional 14,000 mental health counselors into schools, including rural areas. Some of those mental health professionals were supposed to be placed directly into rural areas. And the Biden administration made it a priority not just to fund services, but to build a pipeline of mental health professionals who reflect and understand the communities that they serve, like those who are from rural areas and who could support students in rural areas in the long term. So without the continued investment in rural schools, those communities could be left behind without staff, partnerships, or the funding to fill in some of these gaps that I talked about. And so the federal role in education exists because we know states don't always serve all students fairly. And that's why these laws were created. That's why Title I exists. That's why the U.S. Department of Education exists. And so we can't allow it to be dismantled and abandon the rural students, as I said in that piece, because we will ultimately see students like the students in rural areas or students of color, English language learners, immigrant communities, and students with disabilities left behind.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kayla. I'm thinking about a school that I visited in Madison last year, or outside of Madison, a rural school outside of Madison, where one of the students there credited some of the school-based mental health services program. I may be forgetting that grant name, but that one with saving her life, frankly. So it was really great to hear, but how important these programs are. There we go. Melissa, I'm going to go to you next. Thanks for your patience, but I'm really excited to hear your perspective. I'd love for you to tie together everything we've learned so far to help us understand how the National Rural Ed Association is working to support rural districts. I know you work really closely with so many rural districts and states across the country as they navigate all these changes that we've discussed. And specifically, would love for you to dive into your strategy to identify some of those federal revenue streams that are available and how these funds can be blended and braided. And I know, and not to give you too much in one question, but I know that also you have insights on how states are responding and in the best ways to leverage as well as the best ways to leverage the many assets that exist in rural communities. So yeah, there's a lot in that question, but would love for the audience to hear about the great work you're doing.
Well, first of all, Julia, it's good to see you. And I'm so happy to join you and the other panelists in this very important discussion on how rural education is being impacted right now. So at NREA, we're responding to this playing field in primarily two different ways. First, through advocacy, and then second, through advocacy building. So from an advocacy standpoint, we're pressing Congress and federal agencies to protect what remains of rural targeted funding, like Secure Rural Schools funding, and like the Rural Education Achievement Program, or REAP funding. And we're also mapping where federal revenue streams still exist. And those are things that rural leaders might not yet be fully leveraging. We often hear talk, and it's been said by some of the panelists, that rural schools do more with less, but there is a point in which less becomes just unsustainable. And so for many of our rural districts across the country, we're teetering dangerously close to that line. Federal education dollars are not just supplemental in rural places, they're foundational. So Title I's been talked about, that it can help keep class sizes manageable and provide interventionists, and IDEA that ensures that we support our students with disabilities in inclusive and meaningful ways. And for those smallest, most remote districts, programs like RLIS and SRSA are not just acronyms, they're really lifelines. So when these dollars are reduced or they disappear altogether, there's nowhere to shift that cost. And rural communities are not sitting on booming property tax revenues or large commercial tax bases for the most part. And in fact, many are facing declining enrollment and population loss, which further reduces state allocations. And so that really does create a devastating loop. The other side of these cuts is equally concerning, which is the erosion of technical assistance and capacity building programs. So programs like the comprehensive centers or the regional labs or seed grants, which often brought rural relevant expertise into our systems. And without them, we're not just short on money, we're short on knowledge, which means we have to try to figure it out without the scaffolding or the partnerships that larger districts or urban regions might take for granted. And perhaps most damaging of all is the toll on trust and morale. Educators are being asked to transform systems to personalize learning, incorporate AI, all of those things, with often shrinking budgets and, in fact, growing responsibilities. And it's demoralizing to be told to innovate when you can barely keep the lights on in the gym. So yes, rural schools have been resilient, and we do stretch every dollar, and we share every role, and we make it work, but we really are near a tipping point. Resilience can't be a reason to underfund us, because when the floor falls out, it's our kids and our communities who pay the price. Now, you mentioned what are states doing. So across the country, states are responding to federal budget cuts in a variety of ways, some with urgency, some with creativity, and some with silence. The truth is, while there are states that are stepping up, there are others that are simply shifting the weight of the problem down the chain, and that leaves rural districts in a position where they have to figure it out on their own. But that said, we have seen some encouraging moves. There are states that are increasing the flexibility within their CTE programs and allowing schools to stack courses across multiple sites and delivery formats. And that's something that's been a game changer geographically for geographically dispersed districts. And it means that small schools can now offer things like construction trades or early childhood development by braiding online content and on-site mentors and dual enrollment with, for example, a local community college. And it's a workaround that's made possible by policy, not necessarily new dollars, but it is helping rural schools to create some relevant career pathways. So that's one of the things. We're seeing a rise in regional service centers and educational collaboratives that can work together to assist schools with either programming or other kinds of let's make it work to ensure that rural schools are being able to stand up substantive programming. There's already been some talk about philanthropic dollars, but that is something that rural districts can potentially look to, along with local ballot initiatives or some other unconventional partnerships, like working with a local hospital or health provider on standing up a regional clinic in response to potentially shared space on a campus. As far as braiding and blending of funds, it's not just you have to think about it and maybe it's an option, but it really is something that we have to do because we are under-resourced in places where a single stream of revenue is not enough to stand up programming. So if you wanted to stand up an MTSS system, you're braiding Title I for academic intervention and IDEA to ensure that you're supporting inclusive practices, and maybe 21st century learning centers to fund extended programming into school hours. And then maybe you're tapping into your local church for donated meals and snacks. None of those dollars would have covered the full model alone, but together they're able to build something pretty powerful. I want to be clear that blending funds is not a solution for inadequate funding, but it is a strategy to stretch insufficient dollars as far as they'll go. And it is a testament to rural innovation and determination, but it also signals a need for greater support, whether it's for technical assistance or clearer guidance or staffing capacity to manage it all responsibly. You mentioned community asset mapping, and that's something that I think is really important to touch on here. One of the most undervalued assets in rural communities is our people. And in places where budgets are tight and staffing is lean, community asset mapping reminds us that leadership isn't always positional, and it's not about who's on the payroll, it's about who's willing to show up. Too often when we talk about funding, we fall into that scarcity mindset, and it's what don't we have and what can't we be able to afford. But rural communities are rich in other ways, where you have relationships and you have a deep-rooted sense of collaborative and collective responsibility. And asset mapping is a practice that can help us refocus on that abundance by identifying both formal institutions like the local library or the food bank or the clinic down the road. But it also surfaces informal networks too, which maybe is a retired teacher who still tutors, or it's a rancher who lets the FFA team use their barn, or the church group that cooks meals every Wednesday. Or the tribal elder who leads language and storytelling circles. So making sure that we are asset mapping to shift that leadership mindset. It frames the question from what are we missing to what can we do with what we already have. And it empowers leaders, especially those in isolated or underfunded places, to stop waiting for help and to start building from within. Because when you name your assets, you can better align them to your needs. You can connect what's important to what's possible. So yes, we need more funding, no doubt about it, but we also need to recognize and honor and activate the wealth that we already have in our communities. Because in rural education, the answer isn't always get more, sometimes it's see more.
Thank you, Melissa. Yes, I love the way you framed that. What can we do with what we have? So thank you again to all of our panelists for giving us that context, giving us your insights. And so I have a few questions that I want to ask of all of our panelists so that we can engage in an interactive discussion. And here I really, kind of to Melissa's point, want to shift our focus from the current challenges to potential solutions. So in other words, I think the audience would love to hear more from you about what strategies and assets can help ensure that children in rural communities and their families can thrive. And as Sierra mentioned at the top, we know that majority of the grade level reading communities, community coalitions are in rural communities. So I want to call in a few of those as we go through to weigh in and add their reflections. And I just encourage everyone, we've got, we end at 4:30 Eastern. So just encourage everyone to kind of be succinct so that we can get through as much as we can. But before I start with kind of the solutions piece, there was one additional topic I'd like to bring up. Many rural communities disproportionately rely on public broadcasting. And so how have you all seen or how might we see decreases in public broadcasting access impact rural communities? So I'll start with Melissa, but I really would love to hear from whichever of our panelists have thoughts on this topic.
Yeah. Julia, I do want to say thank you for raising this issue, because the cuts to public broadcasting are often overlooked and they're felt deeply in rural communities. In rural places, it's not just about news or entertainment. It really is part of the educational infrastructure. And for families that don't have broadband or cable, that capacity for PBS has long been a reliable and accessible source of high quality research-based early learning. Stations provide curriculum-aligned programming like PBS Kids, which reinforces foundational skills for young learners. And when stations lose funding, it's not just a programming issue, it's a learning loss issue. But it does go beyond young children. In districts that I've worked with, the stations often serve as true partners to the schools, and they amplify student storytelling. They host college and career readiness segments. They co-produce with teachers for professional development content. And those partnerships, when you lose that window into what's working in education, it's a loss for not just that community, but for all of us. In our smallest and most isolated communities, these serve as the only media infrastructure that is left after the newspaper shut down or commercial stations consolidate. And they are used as a vital source of emergency communication, for civic engagement, and for cultural preservation. So it's not just about content, it's about presence. And I'll stop there and let my co-panelists weigh in on this issue.
Yeah, do any of our other panelists have something to add here?
I mean, I think Melissa just explained it so perfectly and so well. The only thing I want to bring to this is that I used to drive from Toledo to Des Moines, Iowa. And after a while, I knew every NPR station from between those places. And the thing that was great about that is that there's the news, there's the entertainment, things like that. But I just learned about communities from those stations. And so, and just learning about the, the diversity and the vibrancy of all these communities. And that is what we lose if we lose those stations.
Thank you so much for that. Any other thoughts on public broadcasting? And if not, I'll shift to some of our other questions. Okay, great. So I want to build on Melissa's comments from earlier as we were talking about, and ask our panelists as well as some of our audience members about the unique assets that exist in rural communities and how to leverage these assets. So to start, I'm going to call on, and I'm hoping that we have the tech figured out for this, but I'm going to call on some of our GLR communities in the audience first to share their thoughts in reaction to this. So do we have Margaret and Georgia on the line? And can you share your reactions and reflections in terms of some of the assets in your local network that can be leveraged?
Looks like we might be pivoting. I don't see them yet.
All good.
So we'll pivot, and if they come on, I'll let you.
No problem. Well, also, I think if there's anyone from some of our GLR communities who would also like to chime in about some of these assets, that would be great as well. Feel free to, I think, raise your hand and we can unmute you.
And I will say, while we're waiting, I'll just do another plug for questions. If anyone has any questions, we'll have some time to dig into those, so feel free to put those in the Q&A box. But while we wait, I think we can just kind of continue with, oh, wait, let's see, we have, oh no, maybe it was a phantom hand raise. But no, while we wait, if we want to just continue with the conversation, if anyone else has anything to add, and then we can go from there unless, oh, let's see, actually, I see that Beth Duda has her hand raised, so let me turn to Beth. Beth, I'm going to let you come off mute if you want to hop in. You should be okay to speak now.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, sounds good.
So I'm the director of the Suncoast campaign for grade level reading, and we're a 4-county initiative in Charlotte, DeSoto, Manatee, and Sarasota counties. And our DeSoto County is a rural community. Agriculture and cattle ranching are some of the big things that are happening there. And, in terms of how we're approaching the work, we're working with all of, the partner organizations that we've cultivated relationships with, and really blending and braiding different funding sources. I'm fortunate to work with the Patterson Foundation, and certainly those philanthropic dollars help seed some of the initiatives that are happening. But the reality is we have to work very closely with the school district and the sheriff's department and the county commission and the city office and our boys and girls clubs and the YMCAs and all of those places to identify our shared aspirations and blend the funds that are already kind of mission driven with each one of those organizations and find a way that we can kind of cobble that all together to help us do the work that we know is going to be so important for the families.
Yeah, thank you so much, Beth. That's really important contribution, and thank you for doing that work. Josie and Myra, I know that you're really working closely on the ground with community leaders on a daily basis. So would also love if you have any thoughts here about how to kind of think about some of these assets. Josie, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think it honestly starts with just getting in conversation with people. Like getting into conversation with the people who you know care about something somewhat similar to what you care about, the organizations who have somewhat similarities, because there's often so much more that's there. And often the conversation that you're having is the conversation they're having. And this is just something that we've been doing really recently in a different way, though we've always been in conversations with each other, but having much more of a focus of what is the thing that we could come together on to not just cooperate, but actually collaborate and do some of that braiding. That braiding is a new thing for me. So even to hear that, I think is just a beautiful image to consider the way that we collaborate and actually intertwine and think about the unique roles that each of us can play, because we're all in this game, in this work together for a specific reason and have our own unique focus. But we often don't know what that focus is of the people who are in this arena with us. And so the more that we can get in conversation is something we just did just yesterday, had a conversation with somebody just very informally. And it just happened to bubble up that there's something that we would like to work on in the same way, but we have more funding than they do, and they have more expertise than we do. And so how can we move forward just from that really small seed to begin with?
Thank you. Yeah. And Myra, anything that you would like to add here?
Yeah, I'll just add very high level. I think it's important to consider that asset mapping is such an important aspect of community organizing, right? And as we think about advocacy and the way advocacy needs to shift in order to ensure that we're connecting with community and be more grounded in community, and frankly, breaking down those silos that we impose upon ourselves sometimes, looking to community organizing as the source, as the teacher, is something that I would encourage all of us to do. So for the person that asked that question, are you connected to local organizers on the ground, organizations that are organizing community members and families, and start to build that relationship? I think if there's anything that we've learned, coming out of the pandemic, but also in this very challenging time, is the importance of being more connected to each other as neighbors, as community members, and ensuring we are working more closely together in solidarity. And part of that is learning from folks that are grounded in those experiences. And I would look no further than our community organizers to do that.
And Benga, Kayla, Emily, both with the asset mapping, but also kind of thinking about the blending and braiding of funding here. Would love to hear if you have kind of any contributions here as well. If not, I can jump to some of the questions in the Q&A.
I was going to say you can jump to the Q&A. I was only going to say is that hopefully, and this is one of the difficulties in the rural aspect, is the private and philanthropic funding is not at the level as metro areas. And so I think it's been a big push to try to get them involved. And I think a lot of it is having, I don't like using this term, but like shovel-ready projects, but more of like, these are the things where your money can go to directly, and to be able to show like, then as you invest there, this is the return, the value on it, that is not, some huge return, but it's still, there's a return there that people need to see.
Yeah, thank you.
And Julia, if I could
Please.
just say one last thing about asset mapping, it is a powerful way to build relational trust, because it's not just a one-time inventory. If it's done correctly, as to Josie's point, it should be a conversation that positions the school as the central hub in the ecosystem of a community. And when schools lean into that role, the benefits really do ripple outward. There's more community investment, there's stronger partnerships that are possible, and there's a shared sense of purpose. So it is really something worth taking a look at if that's not something that you've already done in your local area.
I'm going to turn to a question in the Q&A that I think is a really important one. And this is community schools are often framed as a strategy to address some of these systemic inequities, integrating health, social services, family engagement. And so given the unique challenges faced by rural communities, such as geographic isolation, under-resourced institutions, and limited access to healthcare, do we have insights on how the community school approach can be adapted or supported to meet the needs of rural children and families without placing additional burdens on already strained local systems? Kayla, I'm going to have you start with this one just because I know how much work the department did with community schools and working with rural communities in the previous administration. So I'm going to start with you here.
Yeah, one of the things that we did to address this was kind of coalition building. So making sure organizations across different rural communities were able to pull resources together and learn from each other and work together to provide some of those supports that we know are sometimes, there are some supports in some rural communities that aren't existent in others. Like my fellow panelist said, no rural community is exactly the same. And so I think we have begun to see some really great work, I think, in Kentucky, where they are working across the state, pulling different resources together to work together to create community schools, not just in one rural community, but in multiple communities. I think also the internet is working great to provide health services and other services that might not be available in the community, but maybe students may be able to access through the web, and we've seen some success with that as well.
And I'm gonna, Benga, you already answered this question in the Q&A, but I was hoping to kind of turn it over to you to talk about broadband access in rural communities a little bit more, just because I think that's something we haven't touched on as much in this conversation, and would love for you to kind of expand on the gap in internet access in rural communities.
Yeah, that was a really good question about how are we closing that gap. And in the previous administration, there was a bipartisan infrastructure law that put about $65 billion towards trying to close that gap. Money went to the FCC, NTIA at Commerce, and then at USDA at Rural Development. And while one of the issues was that it was just difficult to deploy quickly, there's a lot of issues with environmental review and things like that. And so, but there was a big push to be mostly like with fiber. And I think the biggest thing and the important thing about that law was that it was the last mile, that a lot of funding beforehand was about just trying to get some of it. And that last mile is always the hardest and the most expensive. And so previous administrations had kind of just said, well, let's just get, some of it done, it will be good. The last administration said, we'll get to the last mile. What's happened, and one of the problems with that, most of the money went to Commerce, and that money went to the state. And a lot of times, especially when it comes to rural places, that when things go through the state, it doesn't always get to these rural communities. That states always focus on the major metropolitan or the capital cities. And so one of the difficulties it took about, even though the law was passed at the end of 2021, it was about 3 years before states even had a plan to do it. And then what happened is that this new administration came in and they shifted from fiber only to what they call technology neutral and focusing on others. And so this is providing a further delay. And so I think the important thing is that that money's there, that money's been obligated. Part of the advocacy needs to be like, we need to get that money into the ground, into internet, and to be able to do that because the money's there. The law was passed, and so I think the biggest thing is just to get on the policymakers to actually get in. Because to Kayla's point, that internet access is helpful for a lot of things, for a lot of places, for a lot of people, and a lot of communities.
Thank you. And I'm going to keep going because I want to try to get through as many of these questions as we can before we wrap up. But we have a question here. As we continue to see the ripple effects of job losses and layoffs, especially those tied to work visas and shifting immigration policies, rural communities are facing disruption. So how can school and community leaders better anticipate and respond to the impact these changes have on student enrollment, family stability, and access to early learning and literacy supports? And so Myra and Emily, I would love for both of you to take a stab at this question.
Sure, absolutely. And such a great question. I think a lot of folks are wondering right now, what can be done in order to support immigrant families in this time? And what we are doing in California, and I know many of our partners across the country, as well as our national partners like the Center for Law and Social Policy through the Children Thrive Action Network, is promoting policies and initiatives that promote safe and welcoming environments for students, both from early childhood through high school. It's the importance of putting in policies in place that tell students and immigrant families that they are welcome here, but it also equips teachers, administrators, school staff, what to do if ICE comes on campus, what to look for as far as a warrant is concerned, and being able to be informed with our rights. I think the thing that has made the biggest difference in this environment is that knowledge is power. Now, that information of knowing your rights, of knowing what you can push back and where you cannot, is incredibly important and empowers people to be able to protect their students and their families. And there are toolkits associated with that to provide resources to schools and early learning centers to do just that. A number of states across the country have also passed state policies regarding safer environments. California in particular has passed the California Values Act as well as the Safe Schools Act. But even beyond that, this is often a local issue that can move forward either at the district level or at the school level itself. Lately, we have been trying to do more in the early childhood and early care and learning space because there is less specific policies associated with childcare providers, frankly, because the diversity of childcare providers is so vast. You have family, friends, and neighbors, you've got agencies, you have standalone sites. And so because of that diversity, there needs to be more specific initiatives and policies targeting early childhood settings. But I think these safe school policies, these welcoming environment policies is particularly impactful and has made a difference. And I'm sure Emily has more, and I can drop a few links there to provide more information.
I very much ditto everything that Myra just said. And what I would add is in Virginia, specifically in our Northern Virginia school system, they are bringing in family liaisons, trusted messengers that are not part of our Department of Social Services system. They are not social workers that are embedded in our agencies that families often see as family policing systems. They are community members. They are trusted partners that know how to navigate community resources and are really being deployed to support families that maybe have a chilling effect from all of the horrible policies that are coming down and the ICE agents that are waiting outside of our schools and outside of our court systems. And families don't want to interact with many of our systems that we would hope would set them up for success. So we're really looking for creative ways to employ trusted messengers and family liaisons and folks that can help families receive the support that they need. In terms of policies, I was just having a conversation with a youth advocate earlier today around ways that in light of decisions that are being made at the federal government to share folks Medicaid that are on Medicaid and SNAP and their information with the federal government, are there policies that we can put in place at the state level that would supersede some of this and safeguard the information? We are having a difficult time as an advocacy organization telling folks to continue applying for benefits, knowing that it may not be safe for them to do so. Similarly, with folks going to court cases and folks taking their kids to school and really trying to identify ways that, just as Myra said, they are safe and welcoming places and that there are trusted folks there that can help guide them and get them resources and answers, and not just sending families to a system that we're not sure if it's going to be used, for its intended purposes. And so that's the only thing that I would really add there is just finding ways to use community health workers and trusted community partners to build those bridges and trust and relationship with families. I think there's a lot of folks that are just not going to seek out help, and there's still help that exists in ways that we can help families get the support that they need in holistic ways while also protecting them, and encourage folks in their own communities to find out who some of those trusted partners and messengers might be.
And thank you. And here's a question. I'm going to have Melissa, I kind of put you on the spot with this one, hopefully. But I was wondering, there's a question, are there any efforts in states that permit legislation by proposition to write and get signatures to propositions to go onto state ballots to ensure adequate funding to meet rural community needs? So I know that you've been working a lot with states on and in districts on how to think about advocacy efforts. So I was curious if you had any insight here.
Yeah, we have 45 state affiliates that we're working with right now. This is a great question. And unfortunately, I don't know of any grassroots level work being done at the state level that's specific to rural in this area. If there are others on the panel that have those states identified, I'd love to know what they are too. But to my knowledge, unfortunately, not right now.
And Josie, I was wondering also for that question, I know it's different in South Dakota, but was curious if you had any insight into some of the advocacy efforts that you all are taking on in South Dakota as it relates to working with the state to support schools.
Honestly, not right now. I think this is a conversation that we're also trying to find the answers to. There's been a number of efforts to at least be just advocating and reaching out to state representatives, the senators, and they've been responsive. Their staff has been responsive in providing some resources. But that's the current state of things right now from my point of view.
Thank you. So we've got just a couple minutes before we wrap up. And so if you have any kind of lingering questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. But I wanted to give, because there are some questions that are kind of still outstanding or got answered via typing. So I wanted to give our panelists a second to see, and see if there was anything else that you wanted to add as kind of closing thoughts. And I can call on you if you would like. Melissa, can I start with you?
Sure. This has been just a very engaging conversation, and I appreciate everything that the other panelists have brought to the discussion. I would say start with those federal and state streams where you might be underutilizing what's there. Programs like your title funding, your IDEA, Perkins 21st Century, that can be braided and blending to create some comprehensive services. Tap into those non-traditional partnerships that could be found with your workforce development boards or local employers or district partnering with hospitals, those kinds of things, to start those conversations. Look to regional collaborations and others that are in your area that might be interested in standing up programming or pooling resources with you. And don't underestimate those community assets. And then last, I would say advocate. I mean, we are here because we know how important rural education is and how much our rural students deserve a robust and healthy place to learn and to thrive. And NREA is working to ensure that rural schools have that voice at the federal and state levels. And part of that helping is ensuring that leaders understand where the funding exists, but reminding policymakers too that rural schools can't be expected to innovate on a shoestring budget. And we all need to tell our stories. You're your expert in your rural community that can really talk about how a small investment transforms student outcomes for your schools. And so making sure that you're just elevating your story to those conversations is vitally important.
Thank you. And I think we are coming up on time, and I think that, Melissa, that's a great way to kind of wrap things up and to close us out with a call to action. And so I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for all your engagement and for the great questions. And thank you again to our panelists and to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sierra.
Sounds good. I mean, I have no choice but to echo all of the great thanks that Julia gave to all of you. This was an outstanding panel. And as you can see in the chat, everyone is very thankful for you and the guidance and the advice and just the commentary and the thoughts that you offered in this conversation. So I really, really want to thank all of you for sharing your voices. And Julia, thank you so much for leading everyone through the conversation. You did a fantastic job at making sure we heard from everyone and heard these great ideas, and really appreciate you. As a quick reminder, I also wanted to share that we will be sending out a follow-up email for the session, which will include all of the slides, the bios, the recording from the conversation, and every single resource, and probably more, that were featured in today's conversation. So keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, though, I did want to share that there is only one day left in GLR Week 2025, taking place tomorrow on Thursday. As always, we will have a session at 12:30 Eastern Time, like Leah mentioned at the top of the webinar. That'll be focused on the prospects of ALICE families. And at 3 p.m., we will be discussing homeschooling, the rise of homeschooling with Parents' Choice and Parents Curating. So please take a look there. The link is in the chat. We also encourage you to take a look at all of the state and community events that are taking place this week. You can follow this link that Sarah posted in the chat. Thank you, Sarah. And take a look at all of those great opportunities. As we mentioned, in August, we're taking a very short break from our live conversations that we have on Zoom. But if you miss us too much, you're welcome to tune in to our YouTube channel, where we will be having all of these great conversations, kind of focused a lot on what we were discussing today. And this conversation will be one of those rebroadcasts. So in case you want to listen in and, think even further about what you heard, that will be a great opportunity there. And lastly, we'll be back in September with our live sessions. September 2nd will be our first as we kick off the month with our Beyond Decoding NAEP series. On the 9th, we'll have a double header, starting with the Crucible of Practice Salon and a Parents as Curators conversation. On the 16th, we'll have a great funder to funder conversation at 12:30 p.m. And on September 30th, we will have a peer exchange learning conversation on early relational health. So lots of great opportunities coming your way, both tomorrow and in August and in September. So for any or all of those that you're able to attend, we appreciate it in advance. And with that, I will let you all go and let you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. But thank you again to our amazing panel and to all of you for tuning in. Thank you so much.